So thank you for coming. It's quite late in Germany, but it's great that you are all here. And I will start now officially our lecture, dear students and dear colleagues here and in the virtual space. I would like to welcome you to the fourth lecture series, Current Perspectives on Social Work, which today comes from Canada. Our speaker today is Marylin Dupree, who will introduce us to the structural social work approach. This approach has so far received little attention in Germany. At its center is the idea of looking at structures that create the social work user in the first place. This perspective is theoretically justified, but the structural social work does not remain confined to theoretical analysis, but also derives from recommendation for action. This approach makes it especially interesting for a dual study program. I'm delighted that we are able to welcome Marylin Dupree, one of the most prominent representatives of this approach, to give us a lecture. Marylin Dupree is a professor at St. Thomas University in Canada, but she also has extensive experience in frontline social work. She is co-author of the textbook Structural Social Work and is presenting this approach for the first time in Germany today. Like all presentations in the series, this is primarily aimed at students, and the speakers are encouraged not so much to give an impressive lectures for other lectures, but to inspire students for their field of research. All presentations are recorded and put online on YouTube so that they can be watched afterwards and used for seminars and lectures. Only the speakers and moderators can be seen on the camera images. After the presentation in the virtual room, participants in the virtual room can ask questions using the chat. Viewers here in the Rosenberg room write their question on the cards at their seats, which I can then read to Marylin. Let us now welcome Marylin to the stage and listen to her for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for that really warm welcome. And thank you for inviting me to be able to speak today about structural social work. I have up in front on the slide a picture of the university, St. Thomas University. And the reason I wanted to show my university that I graduated from as a Bachelor of Social Work student, and I'm now the director of the School of Social Work at the same university, is because this is the university where Bob Mullally first established a structural school of social work. It was very small at the time. There was only one other university in Canada, Carleton University, that adopted this structural perspective on looking at social problems and issues. And so this very small, and at one time it was a very Roman Catholic university, which had been established here in Fredericton initially by priests. Now, of course, it's much more into a liberal ideology and comes from a very critical perspective on most issues like sociology, political science, but it still stays small and very true to its roots in terms of the School of Social Work, which has been here since the late 70s, started by Bob Mullally. And I really do want to emphasize that Bob Mullally is really the person that I'm presenting on behalf of today. Bob is here back in Fredericton after a long career in which he was, he traveled to Australia. He was director of the School of Social Work in a university in Australia, came back to Canada and was a dean of social work out in Winnipeg in Manitoba, a province in Canada. And then he returned here to his roots. And his roots are in a working class city here in New Brunswick called St. John. And that's where Bob really, as a young person, was able to see how poverty impacted the ability of people to take advantage of opportunities, job opportunities, opportunities to get better educated. And he also saw the impact of how people make assumptions about people based on where they live or the kind of working class background they come from, because he lived in a part of St. John called the South End. And the South End was known to be very working class, low socioeconomic status. And so he grew up seeing the impact of these assumptions about poverty and how they impacted the people that lived there and the children that lived there. And so that really was the impetus for him to get into social work. And by coincidence, I lived just outside St. John in a small fishing village. And although I didn't know Bob Mullally when I was growing up, he's probably about 10 years my senior. You know, we experienced the same kinds of class, I would call class assumptions and class conflict that that we each shared. He in his own place in St. John, and mine in my fishing village, where assumptions were made about, people coming from this lower class, small village where it's rural. People don't earn, it's a subsistent economy. So when I had to go to school in St. John, I was bused to school on school buses. There were assumptions made about who I was and who my family was and what my community was about. And so for me, that was the impetus or motivation for me to start questioning, why is this? Why is it that because I come in on a school bus from this little rural village, that people think I'm lesser than people who come from a higher socioeconomic status and, attend this high school, and they can attend after school events and do after school activities that I could not because I had to go home every day on the school bus. So again, it's kind of like the dissatisfaction that a lot of people who come to social work experience because they see that things are not explainable in a way that's fair. I mean, we look for equity and fairness. So most people come to social work because they have a sense that things aren't fair, things aren't equitable. And usually it's because of their own experience growing up or in the workplace. And so it was for Bob Mullally, so it was for me. So structural social work was a personal journey as well as an academic one. I will say I sent you the article on Maurice Moreau because really his journey, as you saw, he passed away from AIDS in the 90s. He had his own journey, and he saw the unfairness from his position as a professor in social work at Carleton University. And so in the beginning, it was really just St. Thomas University and Carleton University in Ottawa that had this beginning of a structural perspective in which we really started to question the social and economic arrangements that that created the welfare state, but also contributed to the way the welfare state treated the people, the service users that accessed the programs and services within it. And so that's why I put here the picture of St. Thomas, and to this day, we have a structural perspective here at the university, which we put in our vision and our mission statement, which I've got up there. And that is that we really, we take a more progressive view of society and promote social justice through strengthening of human relationships, but also transforming oppressive systems. That's key. It's twofold. We work with individuals to help them resolve their personal issues, but at the same time, our work in structural social work focuses on transforming oppressive systems. And so here at the school, and we have to state our mission at the schools of social work in Canada, we're committed to a politicized, anti-oppressive social work education, because we see social work as a political profession because of that connection between the personal and the political in addressing oppressive systems. So I sent you a very good article in terms of Maurice Moreau's contributions to structural social work and why he felt that social work was not addressing issues that were coming up within the social welfare state. And, you know, we had a very active social welfare state after the end of World War II. And many of our social welfare institutions were developed to respond to social problems that were created after the war, post-war era, when there was a need for more employment, that there were people returning that had high rates of disability because of things that had happened to them in the war. It was kind of an economic boom at that point, but yet there was still a lot of poverty that was occurring even during these economic boom times. And what was happening is that individuals, like I said about my own experience in St. John, were experiencing problems, but it was generally seen as a fault of the person, that the person didn't get a proper education, they didn't take advantage of educational opportunities, or they lived in the wrong area. Maybe if they just moved to a better part of town, they would learn to behave like more successful people. Or maybe if, in terms of employment, maybe they're just lazy. Maybe they're used to getting income support payments and they're not interested in working because they prefer a handout from the states. So what happened is that personal problems were not viewed in terms of how the economic and social system contributed to those problems. Maybe there was a high rate of unemployment in the area in which they lived, but instead of looking at that as the issue, they looked at the individual as not being employable. So what we call blaming the victim. And at the time, we had a liberal ideology in place after the war. And I put this quote in from Hugh Shewell, who is a professor of social work at Carleton University and also a structural social work professor. And he stated that socialized as we are into liberal ideology, the ideology of individualism, false freedom in the marketplace, and exploitative capitalism, there's still an insistence on focusing on the individual as the problem. This is the fundamental contradiction that structural social work theory is based on, is the fact that, despite all these social, economic, and political issues, we still look at the person as the cause of their own problems. And that's not to say that individuals don't have a role to play in addressing the issues that they're experiencing, but we put it in a larger context, right? In terms of how we're going to address those issues. So structural social work was developed by Maurice Moreau, and he had input from his colleagues who were left-leaning, came from a critical social theory background, and they were at the University of Montreal, Université du Québec, McGill University, and it was largely in response to an anti-psychiatry movement and because of critical social theory that was coming also at the time, like labeling and deviancy theories. And they really highlighted the social control function of social work and really challenged us to look at how much do social workers contribute to the problems that their service users are experiencing. When we think of child protection, for example, and I'm sure that in Germany, you have child protection or child welfare services, the same as we do here and in other countries. And a lot of child protection activities are based on kind of policing social control functions. We make assumptions about parenting, whether it's good enough. We make assumptions about, especially around neglect issues, which can be linked to poverty, for example. So a lot of these social control functions were being challenged by critical social theorists to say, you're not really addressing the social issues that your profession states that it's supposed to be addressing. What's happening is that you're just policing or perpetuating what the state is doing rather than looking at social work in terms of the goal of social justice. You're just carrying out state functioning. And so a lot of that began to be challenged by these professors in social work who were dissatisfied with the role of social work in society. So the theoretical framework, and if you looked at Bob's book, and as I say, I really am speaking today as a person who has learned a lot from Bob Mullally. I was taught by him at St. Thomas University when I came here in the late 80s, and it was kind of eye-opening for me. I suddenly saw, why things were the way they were, and was very interested, in the critical analysis of social problems. And I was really interested in, given those bigger issues, how can we address that? How could people address those issues within this helping profession? So when I came to St. Thomas, Bob Mullally was just returning from a sabbatical in Sweden, where he went to study a social democratic form of social welfare and the kind of their social welfare system, which was really geared to family policy. And he was very interested because it seemed to him that that was a more progressive approach. And so that's why structural social work is based on socialist ideology. It has a radical social work heritage coming from some of the left-leaning social theorists at the time. It has a critical theory base. The whole point of structural social work is to change systems to make them more responsive to people's issues. Uses a dialectical analysis, which I'll talk about later. And it integrates all these pieces into what we call a transformative social work practice, because it's about making social change. It's about changing our social systems to be more social democratic, to empower individuals, to have more participatory decision making, to have service users more involved in having a say and developing some of the approaches that we actually put in programming and into services. And so this book that Melanie has referred to, The New Structural Social Work, is really about a revitalized socialist ideology, looking at social democracy and the kind of social welfare system that is possible, because we've seen it in Nordic countries and it's very successful. Is it perfect? No. But the point of transformative social work is to work towards a progressive vision, right? We're always working towards a progressive vision because we know that social, economic, and political systems are constantly changing. And so we have to be responsive to those changes. And so while we never may arrive at a perfect system, we certainly can work towards a more social democratic, empowering, emancipatory social work practice. And so this is what Bob addresses in his textbooks. This one here is the 4th edition. When I first came to St. Thomas University and he had come back from Sweden, this is the book that he wrote at the time, and he would come to class and he would write chapters, and then he would come and teach them in the classroom. And then he would ask for feedback from students. which again is part of that dialectical process and dialogical process of hearing from the people that the information or the services impact the most. They would have a say in what, the service or program, or even what is being taught within the social work education system. And so he would teach the chapters, get feedback from students, and then he put them all together and published this structural social work book, which at the time really looked at class, really focused on poverty. It's only in other editions, when he received critiques from feminism, anti-racist social work, postmodernism, and other social critical critiques, that he had to expand on his understanding of structural social work to include those critiques, because they were very important. And that's why the book we have today, every time we have an edition, it gets a little bit larger, because of course he has to incorporate all this other knowledge and all these other practice skills and ideas for practice. And so it's become a very sophisticated but very vital. And the students that come to learn about structural social work here at St. Thomas, it's very interesting, because they usually experience a kind of eureka moment that, oh, now I understand why things are arranged in a certain way. And they understand that that's not necessarily prescriptive, that we can choose to make changes, that just because something is set up in a certain way, such as the state welfare system, doesn't mean that it's static. We can make changes to that. So there's this awakening that happens. But also I've noticed as an educator that students also, sometimes they can become angry and anxious for the change to take place as soon as possible. Sometimes students can actually go through a period where they're depressed because they've learned about privilege, they've learned about oppression, and it's something that they hadn't really thought of before. So it really is transformative. Even as you study it, it transforms you as a person and as a social worker. And so schools of social work, we are very careful. We have small classes, and it sounds like you do too, where we have 25 students, 30 students at most in a cohort, because we have a lot of discussion and there's a lot of support that happens in the classroom as students work through this critical analysis of the social welfare system, which also questions the role of social work and social work as a profession. It's very critically reflective. And so structural social work really does ask social workers to subscribe to more socialist values, such as social justice, equity, collectivity, and opportunities for people of all classes, races, genders, cultures, sexuality, age, and ability, in order for them to attain personal and social fulfillment. So there's a lot of reflection on your own place in society and the privilege and oppression that you may have experienced as a population or as a group, but also to look at it with the lens of, as a profession, you're in a privileged profession. And what does that mean for the people that you work with? What can you do instead of doing for people? How can you involve them in the helping process? And so it does demand a lot from students when you're learning about structural social work. But when they graduate, you can really see the difference, and they feel very confident. Of course, they would have lots of practical experience in what we call field placements, but we also are very encouraging and stay in touch with students as much as possible Once you study structural social work, you tend to gravitate to other people who have similar viewpoints. That's just natural. And here in New Brunswick, since this is the only English school of structural social work or social work school in the province, most people who work in the social welfare system here have come from St. Thomas and the structural social work perspective. And so there's a lot of mutual understanding around what the role of social work is. As I said, it's informed by radical social work, which we need to understand state power and the role of social work as an element of state control. And we have to look at how our practice must actually challenge those structures which are perpetuating oppression. And so it really comes, a lot of the radical social work comes out of Great Britain in the 70s. And because I'm at an age where I'm now going to be retiring soon, I had the opportunity when I was here at St. Thomas and I attended Carleton University, I met many of the people that contributed to structural social work theory. Peter Leonard was somebody who came from a critical social theory background who really helped to push structural social work in a radical direction. I met Maurice Moreau at a presentation that he did here. And when I attended Carleton, I was able to meet many of the professors that contributed to its genesis. So for me, it was a very personal journey because I got to know the people that were involved in developing this approach. And that made quite a difference for me because you know how it's important to see how people will walk the talk, as we call it here, that they actually live their lives in congruence with the beliefs that they have about social work and the role of social work and the relationships that we have with people. And so you could see how the commitment and kind of the motivation that people had in contributing to this structural social work theory. So it's informed by critical social theory because what we do is we look at social practices and social relationships to see, forms of domination. When I talk about domination, I'm really talking about oppression, oppression and privilege. So we look at, where is oppression occurring within our social practices? It also examines, is there a vision of life that could be free from that domination? And what kind of tasks or practices could we take to make that transformation happen? And so it's committed to changing the world in ways that can help emancipate people who are marginalized by providing them with insights and the intellectual tools they need to help themselves. And so it is very much a walking with a service user type of approach rather than doing for. So it's critical theory because it's critical of existing social, economic, and political institutions. It has an articulated alternative social vision, and it involves people in their own critical analysis of what's happening socially, economically, and politically. And when I talk about a dialectic means that we understand that within the social welfare state, that there are opposing and contradictory forces within social work and within the welfare state. For example, the welfare state has a social care function, but it also has a social control role. So it contains both liberating and oppressive features. So structural social work is to look at what are those emancipatory or transformative potential aspects of social welfare that we can change to make it less oppressive. And so we're looking for ways to make the social welfare state more responsive to individual and group and community needs. And you have the article by Moreau, and he really does, explains in there his look at social problems as not being caused by deficits in communications between individuals. And a lot of conventional social work, that is the focus. You know, if we can only increase communication, if we could only have better communication, and they're associated more with ecological and systems theories. So that's not what structural social work is about, because we really see that there's a conflict between different systems in society, and that we don't have a balance between individuals and systems because they don't have the equal circumstances and power, right, to be equal. And we don't believe that it's necessary that people have to always adapt into existing systems, which may have contributed to the problems that they're experiencing in the first place. And so I put in here this monograph that Maurice Moreau wrote, which kind of outlines his original thoughts around empowerment through structural social work, which I think is still available on websites. So just to quickly talk about what's different about the way we practice structural social work from how conventional or non-structural social work is practiced. And so the difference is that we're always looking to respond to the individual's immediate needs, and of course, respond to their rights and look for resources. Now, in a conventional approach, the worker takes an objective, neutral stance and uses their authority to try and get resources, but doesn't really advocate, because advocacy is kind of a political activity. What they try to do is remain neutral. Like, for instance, here we have a long-term care program for older people, and social workers are asked to go into the home with a menu of services, and the social worker fills out an assessment of the person's activities of daily living, what they're able to do or what they're not able to do. And then they simply look at the list of what they're able to provide in a menu of service, and that's what they get. And so that's how social workers are encouraged to remain neutral or objective within the social welfare system. They're given the menu of services that they can provide. They can't go back and say, well, I really think that this person needs more socialization, and we should be looking at helping that person to get out to social activities. No, because the state has a controlling function. What they want is for the social worker to only put in those services which will help with activities of daily living. So it might be Meals on Wheels, or it might be home care worker, but those are the only choices that the person is given. And the social worker would see that as perfectly, responsible. And this is what you get. You don't get to go outside the box. And so a structural social worker would speak with the person and talk about what are their real needs. Like, yes, you need some help with your activities of daily living, but what else is going on? Is there something else that affects your activities of daily living? Are there other issues? Is your housing adequate? What about transportation? There's a transparency in structural social work around, finding out what other issues that the person is dealing with besides not being able to dress themselves in the morning. There's other issues. There could be family or community issues. The other thing is being transparent with the person in terms of, here's what I can provide based on what's available here. But let's look at, are there other ways that we could help you to meet these needs that aren't covered under this service? And so we're transparent. We're not the expert. And so in a conventional approach, the professional is the expert, and they make all the decisions. For example, again, going back to the assessment for long-term care, the worker goes in, and some workers will take an assessment tool or questionnaire, and they'll check off the boxes of, yes, they'll ask questions, the person responds, and then they'll simply check it off. And at the end of it, the person is either eligible for services or they're not eligible for services. Whereas in structural social work, the social worker would understand the impact of checking those boxes and would see that despite the fact that maybe there were activities of daily living that the person didn't need help with, maybe there were other areas that they did, and a homemaker would be helpful. And so the structural social worker would try to make sure that that person received the help that they needed by using the tool to help the person instead of using it as a tool of the state. And so it really does foster the person, the client, the service users understanding of, in long-term care about how it's limited in terms of the kind of help that it can give. And, what can we do about that? What other things could we link you up with? We have gray advocacy groups here. Could we link them with some organizations that are involved in advocacy for seniors? Like, we really do go beyond just the presenting issue. Whereas with conventional, it really just psychologizes problems. So we would just look at the deficits or limitations that the person presents, and then try to find something that would help them to address that particular deficit. So we're really trying to help them adjust to the fact that maybe they're not able to get outside to social activities, but what we'll do is we'll get a homemaker in here, and they'll have the company of the homemaker for 2 or 3 times a week. And that's not exactly what the person was looking for, but in long-term care, it might be seen as adequate. And so we really do also look to link feelings, thoughts, and behaviors to systems as a whole. Like, why is it that this person is so frustrated? Is filling out all the forms that are required, especially the financial eligibility, is that causing the person to be upset? For example, I remember somebody coming to the food bank when I worked in child welfare, and wanting to get a food basket because they had run out of money on income support and they needed food for their family. And they came in and they were angry. They were raging, at having to come back to ask for food and then being put through a whole system of questions around why they needed the food. Why were they there? Had they tried other things? And so they were very angry. And what happened is, because they were angry and expressing their anger at the workers in the food bank, they were banned. So they were told to go away, and they didn't get the food that they wanted, and they were told not to come back. And so when this person, who was also a client of mine in child protection, when they told me about this, I immediately went with the person to the food bank, and we sat down and had a discussion and worked through that conflict, so that the person at the food bank understood it wasn't the person that the food bank that the client was angry with. It was the system. It was the devaluing way that they thought they were being treated. It was all those other problems that poverty brings, that, when you're worried about your family and you're trying to deal with things as a parent, all those frustrations that come to the fore when you're told, no, you might not be able to get it because you already came to the food bank once this month. So we have to understand the context of some of the people's thoughts and behaviors and why they do things. And we really respect the person's individuality, but we really also look about raising their consciousness about other people in groups who are sharing similar circumstances. So the person that accesses the food bank, they're not the only person that accesses the food bank. There's other people out there who have similar concerns. And there are poverty advocacy groups that they could be in touch with. It's about collectivity and about empowering the person to make changes that they're comfortable with at the level that they're comfortable with. But it's about connecting them to those possibilities instead of just saying, well, next time you come to the food bank, you need to control your anger. You need to say you're sorry, and next time you come, you just keep quiet, and that way you'll get your food basket. That's not the approach that we take. Although, of course, the individual did apologize when they understood that the person at the food bank was more understanding of their circumstances. And so structural social work includes activism. It includes connecting people to others who are experiencing similar issues and who are trying to lobby or advocacy or make positive changes. So it's connecting two different levels of intervention at the personal and intervention at the systemic or structural, what we call the structural level. So lots of times people will say, well, what's the practice approach with structural social work? What's the techniques that are involved? And Bob would always explain, it's not a whole book of techniques or recipes about how to deal with social problems, because society, people, and the interaction between them is complicated. There are no recipes or cookbook approaches to situations. And so we don't subscribe to these kind of technical approaches such as assessment tools. Now, mind you, because we work in a social welfare state, we have to use some of these assessment tools, but we use them in a way that's politically motivated. And at the same time, we also try to bring to light the inadequacies of such a tool and how it doesn't really address some of the issues that we're hearing about and seeing when we work with the people we work with. And so we're really always trying to transform the conditions and structures that cause the negative effects that contribute to individual and personal problems. And so social problems we see are part of social institutions, social practices. They're built into the way that they're structured, the way that the programs are structured. We don't blame the victim. For problems to be solved at the individual level, we have to look at problems being caused at the institutional level. That social inequalities are structural, not because people have innate deficits or limitations or are different. Society functions in ways that discriminate against people, and the state's institutions, laws, and educational systems can function as instruments of oppression and can benefit privileged groups. And we don't see the social worker as being an objective and neutral profession. We don't see knowledge as objective. We know that the dominant groups in society determine a lot of the policies and programs that we use and reflects the interests of the dominant group, which, for most part are white heterosexual males in business or in finance or in some part of the economy. We also look at culture. What's the role of culture in perpetuating discrimination and oppression? We don't just look at culture as a thing that we observe in a museum. Culture has a role, like popular culture. How do they portray people with disabilities on television or in books? Do they portray them as positive people having potential to achieve fulfillment, or do they portray them as victims of their own issues, such as a car accident or something that they've done that would cause injury to themselves? Or do we see it as an issue of accessibility and accommodation, which is a structural issue, right? Our society doesn't accommodate for people who might have a different way with mobility or might have a different way of communicating. We tend not to see that if we don't experience that for ourselves. So we have to have a social change perspective, and that's what structural social work does. It looks at social change and what we need to do to be more inclusive in society and to have people be able to participate more democratically. And we use a critical analysis to do it, which comes from critical social theory. And it allows us to look at the imbalance of power in society and who has the resources and how to realign those resources. And we use critical self-reflection, in which we locate ourselves in the situation and think about how our own personal background contributes to the assumptions that we have about groups of people and how we have to continually challenge ourselves in terms of our assumptions, because they influence the way that we practice and who we want to practice with. And so it's a process that we really need to understand our own privilege and our own power and how it influences how we work with people. Well, that was really it in a nutshell, a very condensed version of structural social work, but I would encourage you to go online and look at the various articles on structural social work. Most, as I said, when we started out in Canada, there were only two schools of social work that came from a structural perspective, and that was St. Thomas University and Carleton University. Now it's a part of almost every university across Canada, and in the United States as well. And one of the things I want to emphasize, because in Maurice Moreau's article, he talks about, how do you practice in a social welfare institution that will not welcome some of these changes? How do you put a social worker into a system where there might be resistance to change? And when I first was hired as a child protection social worker, one of the questions they wanted to know was I a structural social worker? And that wasn't seen as a good thing. It was seen as, are you one of these Malaliites who's going to come in here and think you're going to change everything? And today, our graduates are sought after because of the critical thinking and the critical lens that they have on social issues. And when they come into a work environment, they can see things that maybe can be addressed in terms of the power analysis. Is there a different way of doing things? So we've gone from not being welcome in the workplace to now people asking for our graduates. And we have a very vibrant field placement system, and we now have a graduate school of social work, which also comes from a structural perspective. And so thank you so much for letting me talk about it, and I'll turn it back over to Melanie.
Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting, also a very brief overview over your approach. So students, yes. So the students in the room, if you have got questions, there are papers on your seats. You can just write it down and I will read it to you. And if the participants in the virtual room have got questions, just use the chat function. And meanwhile, I'm a happy person because if people are just writing the question, I can ask a question. So what was interesting for me was a point maybe not just to empower this social service user, but also to maybe to power sharing the knowledge of the social worker. And I'm wondering, what does it mean in concrete? So maybe you are in a consultation and you are explaining what are you doing. So this is interesting for me. What does it mean in concrete? And moreover, how it is accepted by the social service user, because it might be a little bit weird to experience that for the first time, that the social worker explaining you what he or she is doing now.
Okay, I've worked in many different areas in child welfare, and I can tell you that yes, sometimes the client or service user will be surprised because they had previously had a social worker who was more of an expert professional, more of somebody who was telling them what needed to be done rather than looking at things more in a mutual way. And in child protection, it's sometimes very hard to do that. But what we do, and I'll use my own experience in child protection, is that when we're proceeding, when we're addressing issues such as neglect, for example, we really look at neglect from a poverty lens. Like there might be parts of neglect that the person that we're working with needs to address and needs to change, but there's also, we need to talk about poverty and about, the fact that neglect can be a very political term in relation to poverty, and look, at, are they getting the supports they need from income support programs? Is housing an issue? We're really interested in having more context around the issues that they're dealing with, rather than just focusing on the neglect that the referral has been made that the children are going to school hungry, for example. Some more conservative social workers would go in and say that, you need to go to the food bank and you need to get food, and we're going to be checking to make sure that when the kids get to school that they have what they need in their lunches, and we'll be checking in with you on a regular basis. Whereas a structural social worker might sit down and say to the person, because the referrals come in, we do need to make sure that the children are getting what they need nutritionally. Here's some information on some in-school lunch programs and some alternatives, but also, how are you managing on the income support that you are receiving? Maybe there's something that the income support program could provide as a supplement for the family. And we would actually work with them on a plan, rather than saying, we're going to come in here every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We might say, we understand that you're a busy person and that you also have commitments. What days could we come in here and meet with you and talk about how things are going? And so we still are accomplishing what we need to do to make sure the children are getting the food they need, but we're doing it in a more collaborative way with the parent, in trying to build a relationship of trust with that person. Because if you really want to address an issue, you have to have a relationship of trust. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of information that they're never going to share with you because they're too fearful or they have too much anxiety. And so rather than taking a policing role, we're in there in a collaborative role. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have to remove children when necessary or make sure that those children are safe. That's the primary issue, but we're upfront about that. Mm-hmm. We say right up front, this is what our mandate is. Mm-hmm. This is what we have to do if the children aren't safe. So we're transparent. So we do share a lot of information, but we also do that so that the person we're working with will also be able to share with us not only what's happening for them, but maybe they have some ideas on how they could address the issue. How would they address the problem? And so it's a lot more what I call a dialogical relationship, where we go back and forth with the person and come up with what we call more of a collaborative plan. Rather than telling them what to do, we're working with them.
Thank you. So thank you very much for your answer. I think there's some questions in the room, and I've got an assistant who is working in the moment, who will collect the papers. So just a moment.
Any question?
No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm reading the question. The first question: where do you see the limits in structural social work?
You know, that's a challenging question that we get quite a bit, because there's a lot of, or not so much today, but there used to be a lot of criticism of structural social work as being heavily theoretical and not focused on practice. Like, what would be the practice elements? You know, people always saw it as limited in terms of how you could actually use structural social work in practice. And so more of a focus has gone on how do you do structural social work practice? And so that's really been an area for development. The limitations of it are, of course, you're going to be working within a system, a welfare system that comes from a different liberal or conservative ideology than the social worker. And so there's going to be resistance. And the social worker has to know, and this is what we try to also teach, is when there are opportunities to make change, and when there are times when, you know, you have to conform to what is expected of you in the workplace, because we don't want people to be fired because they have a different idea about how to handle a situation. But we try to have students think about what changes they can make and what changes they might propose in a positive way. Because one of the hardest things to learn as a social worker, and I learned it myself, is when I graduated from the School of Social Work, I was radical. I wanted to go out there and I wanted to make changes, because poverty was an issue of dear to my heart, because I saw it so much growing up, and I saw what it could do in terms of marginalizing people and disempowering them. And so when I graduated, I wanted to go in there and I wanted to make change in the system. But what I learned is, if you only ever critique things, if you're only ever critical, that's the only message that people get. Whenever you go in and you critique something, you need to have a constructive recommendation of how things could be done differently or better. It's not enough just to criticize. You have to be able to propose a positive change. And I learned that the hard way because when I was in child welfare, I had a supervisor, and she gave me an evaluation, and she said, Marylin, you're a wonderful social worker, but you're always criticizing the system. You're always criticizing child protection social work, because I came from that political lens. And it was in my evaluation that I was always critical. And that's when I realized that it's not enough. You cannot just be critical. You have to be part of the solution. You can't just point out all the faults and hope that that's somehow going to be meaningful for people and they're going to listen to you. You have to have an idea for how it could be made better, and it has to be respectful. And I really do think that changes can be made within systems if, you know, you follow a particular strategy. For example, here in New Brunswick, our child welfare system is really in a state of flux. There's a lot of issues. Social workers refuse to go into a career in child protection because it's so difficult. There's the legislative part of it, the mandated part, and you're going in and trying to police people. Most people who graduate from social work, it's not their preferred profession. So child protection is trying to address that. And one of the ways that they're doing it is to look at, how are we supervising people? How much freedom are we giving social workers to do things that they think are right with families and working with families collaboratively. How can we change things to work better and more collaboratively with families? So here's the window of opportunity that structural social workers look for to be able to make some of those positive changes. And we also teach that it's about a ripple effect. You know, you can't go into a system and expect to make full-scale changes to that system. Sometimes it means being very um, strategic in the way that you work, in that one small change may lead to another small change. And so there's a ripple effect. And I have seen that because, as I said, when I went to school here at the structural school, when I graduated, they didn't want structural social workers because they were too radical, too critical of the system. But now people want structural social workers because they're interested in making these positive changes to work with people, because we've learned that policing and controlling has not eliminated problems. And we still have as many problems in child protection as we do, you know, back in the 1960s, if not more, especially for our Indigenous communities. Things are not better for the children in those communities. And so over time, the social welfare system has understood that doing things the way they've been doing them does not work. And in fact, it just creates more problems. And so there's more opportunity now, at least here in the Canadian social welfare system, to make those kinds of, maybe you wouldn't call them transformative changes, but more progressive changes. And you're just one part of that change process. It's not up to you to change the whole system. You just have to be part of the change.
Thank you. So maybe here's another question which is similar. As I understand your approach, structural social work also means questioning our own professional routines, questioning the programs of our social institutions, and leaving our secure spots permanently. How do structural social workers deal with that?
Well, it used to be, as I said, that structural social workers were seen as an anomaly, as this radical component of social work that had created a lot of challenge and resistance. But that's no longer the case. And you can, I think that there's more openness to hearing the viewpoints of others, of other perspectives. Just because we're structural social workers doesn't mean that we abandon the things that work in other structural or in other social work theories. Like we look at in ecological theory, for example, or systems theories. There's practice elements within those approaches that we would use in working with individuals in counseling. You know, we do have theories and we do provide therapy, and we look at trauma-informed approaches, and we look at what other social work practice approaches provide. It's just that we add an element to it by looking at power analysis and looking at our own place in the process of helping, and making sure that we understand that social work is a privileged profession, just because it does entail having control over resources, having control over people's lives in many respects, and that we have to try to work more collaboratively with people in terms of, if you want people to make the changes that is going to change their situation, they really need to be in charge of that situation as much as possible. If you want it to be a lasting change, then they have to understand why it's necessary to make the change. And they also have to buy into it. They have to want to be part of that. And to do it is to work collaboratively with other people and not be always telling them what to do. And so we don't throw out all the other practice approaches. We just add to them. We add to them in the way that we work with people.
Thank you. So there's a question in the chat from Annika. Can you read it, Marylin? Can you see it? I can read it loud.
No, I can't.
Oh, so my question would be, if I got it right, the emancipatory part of structural social work is especially about the work with the clients, or is it also about the social work system itself? Because I feel like social work as a profession would have to emancipate itself first to be able to emancipatory in its work with clients or group. Because social work itself is really intertwined within the oppressive system. So can social work really be emancipatory if it's that intertwined, or should we also start working on that?
Well, that's what structural social work was meant to do, is it was brought in because people within the social work profession, such as the people at Carleton University and Maurice Moreau and Bob Mullally, felt that social work wasn't doing the kind of work in helping people that the ethical code, for example, says we're to work towards a goal of social justice. Well, how do you define social justice, and who is defining it? And so, again, the people who initiated structural social work did start by questioning the role of social work itself. What are social workers supposed to be doing? Are they agents of the state, or do they have a separate mandate given to them by the Code of Ethics in which they're to work towards equality and social justice? And so there is we have a heavy reliance in our educational program on helping social work students to understand their ethical obligations under the Code of Ethics. And their ethical obligation, the first ethical obligation, is always to the client or service user or the person they're working with. That's their primary primary ethical obligation, is to that person. And so we really focus on our ethical obligations that we have to the people that are experiencing oppression. That's our focus. And so it's very challenging. And it's funny because it's an interesting question, because we have students who just started in the social work program in third year in this last fall semester. And one of the things that, after they learned some of the theory and some of the facts about social work can be oppressive in the way that we carry out our practice, we were getting feedback from students saying, then what the heck do I want to be a social worker for? Why am I here? I don't understand. If social work is part of the problem, why are you even teaching us? So it's a process of working through that critical reflection in terms of, it doesn't have to be that way. Social work practice doesn't have to be oppressive. We have a profession because we're part of a profession. We meet the definition of profession, but that doesn't mean that we have to carry out our practices in a way that makes us the expert of every situation, and that we really need to be working. Social work does not have the answer to every social problem. We have to work with people to be able to understand what the indicators and elements of a social issue really are. I mean, I would never go into an Indigenous community and impose my views as a white female social worker on Indigenous people. I would understand that, I come from a very Western perspective. They have a very traditional and cultural perspective on what the role of family is, what community is. And so their social workers are educated in a very different way to work within the community. And we support that. We have an Indigenous social work program here for Indigenous social workers, because we believe that, don't really support the idea of cultural competence, that you could be competent in somebody else's culture. We believe that intervention has to be culturally relevant, and that the most relevant culture comes from people who live and work and are part of the community. And so understanding your place in that is very important. I would never think that I could go in and practice in any context, any social context. I don't have experience in that context. I don't understand the cultural issues that people are dealing with. And so it does put a lot of onus on the social worker to understand their own limitations, as well as the limitations of the profession. But it's something that social workers, at least if you come from a critical perspective or progressive, you're constantly questioning your role in working with people or in working with populations. Who do I need to hear from to be able to really understand the situation? Who needs to be involved in resolving it? It's not just about the professional social worker. It's about being able to see the bigger issue and understand that some things need to be addressed by people who are more familiar with that issue.
Thank you, Marylin. So there's another question. Would you change something about the panel system in your country? What's penal system? Panel system? Panel system.
Which system?
Panel, the punish system, is it that?
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Well, yes, because in this country, we typically go between a conservative viewpoint on the penal system or a liberal focus. And a liberal focus is more interested in rehabilitation of the person in the system. We have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our prison systems. And so a liberal approach would be to look at why do we have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people within that system? And what can we do in terms of prevention? What can we do to help return people to their community? And so there's a tension between this conservative and liberal approach. Now, from a structural approach, and our Indigenous communities do this very well, and they believe in restorative justice. And that is within Indigenous communities, the community meets as a group, a circle, they call it circle. And they have the people there that were what we would term as the victims or people that were involved in the receiving end of whatever the crime was, as well as the person that perpetrated the crime. And there would be discussion about, what happened, what people were thinking about. How do we keep this person in community? A lot of it is on, what kind of justice are we seeking, and how do we keep this person in community? And so restorative justice has become a huge part of the criminal justice system here, not just in terms of Indigenous people, but in other elements as well. But again, we're looking at an election coming up in October, I think, of 2025. And the Conservative Party here in Canada is really bent on punishment in terms of keeping people incarcerated for longer, fewer parole opportunities, less opportunity for rehabilitation. For example, the last time we had conservative prime minister, and he took all the counselors and spiritual advisors out of the prisons. So again, we have this constant tension going back and forth, when really I like the Indigenous approach of restorative justice where it's possible.
Thank you. So the last question is a question from Germany to Canada. You teach a lot of structural social work in Canada. Is the average social worker in Canada that critical?
I'm sorry, I missed that. No.
Okay. You teach a lot of structural social work in Canada. Is the average social worker in Canada that critical?
The average.
The average, thank you. The average social worker.
I would say yes, I would say that over the period of time that this was introduced back, I would say 1979, when Maurice Moreau and his colleagues started really thinking about this and writing about it, until now, I would say that most all universities that have schools of social work in Canada have courses, at least, if not the whole program, based on a critical perspective. Now, some of them have more emphasis on Indigenous or feminist perspectives within this critical theory. So, for instance, out west, there are large numbers of Indigenous communities and a large Indigenous population. So a lot of the universities there have really focused on a structural perspective, but more indigenized. It's more of an Indigenous perspective. They've taken elements of structural social work and they've incorporated them into their own perspective. But I would say that the critical perspective is pretty much Canada-wide now.
So the colleagues, yeah, the colleague asked, this is the academic side, but how it is in practical social work?
In practical social work, I can only say from my own experience in working in other provinces, that I guess I've never, yes, I would say in certain provinces, it has more, I guess, reception than in others. For instance, I might go out west to work, because don't forget, this structural social work and critical perspectives are relatively new in terms of being introduced. And so there's a lot of people working in the profession that come from more of a conservative, conventional perspective. So there's still a lot of people working in the field that have not been introduced to critical perspectives. And so if there's a mix of old and new kind of perspectives in the workplace. And I would say that in places like Alberta, where before their School of Social Work was graduating students that came from a more conservative perspective, I don't think that's true now, but there would be a large population of social work practitioners that come from that perspective. And so it's a process. It's a process of change, and it's going to take a long time. And we also have a lot of social workers that come from other countries that work in Canada. For instance, we have social workers from the United States. I'm in a province that's right next door to the state of Maine, and they have a huge social work program. And when I work with people that come from that program, they come from a more conventional approach. But we, in terms of the work that we do, we all respect each other's perspectives, and it's never really been an issue, because when you're working with clients one-on-one, you need the same types of skills. Everybody's working with the same types of skills and assessments and things like that. It's working at the more systemic level that it's different. And so social workers who come from a critical perspective would be more active in the union, for example, because most social workers that are employed by government here or by the school systems are unionized. And so those social workers would be the structural social workers would be very active within the union movement, whereas the other ones may not see a need for that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we will come to the end now. So thank you very much for
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And the inside look in your approach, but also in social work in Canada. Thanks to students and colleagues for the question, and also for being here in a very warm room for all the time. So yeah, bye.